Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Mr Speaker, I'm extremely disappointed in the direction this bill proposes for children and young people. Unlike that member, I attended the ministerial meeting on the drivers of crime hosted by the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Māori Affairs last year, and I'd be interested to know what the Māori Party's view on this particular piece of legislation is. I actually came away from that meeting last year quite heartened by the approach that I thought that the government was going to take over a really important issue. I felt they were going to eschew the law and order drum that they sort of beat the tattoo on every year for several layers of intervention, early intervention, school-based intervention, and then youth development programs that actually were effective in making a difference and turning, really at the last chance, to turn people away from a lifetime of offending. Following on from that meeting, I was then absolutely delighted to see that the Prime Minister had appointed a Chief Science Advisor. And I thought, this is fantastic, especially when I read Professor Peter Gluckman's speech that he gave later on in the year. And let me just quote from that speech. He said, "There is the beginning of the recognition that there is a far greater need for evidence to be rigorously based and inform policy formation, although I hasten to say that there can be many cogent reasons why evidence and policy need not align. The evidence may not be complete," that's the assertion of the member who's just resumed her chair. "The public may not accept the evidence." Well, that's pretty much, I think, a problem that we have in terms of how crime is reported. "It may conflict with the accepted values of a society. The cost implications may be contrary to the approach supported by the evidence." That's why Te Huri Hanga's closed down. "And ultimately, the democratic process will put constraints on decisions that can be made. The important point, however, is not to deny the evidence, but to acknowledge it and explain when and why policies are developed that are not in accordance with the evidence. This policy and this bill is not in accord with the evidence, and I have not heard the Minister stand up and explain why the government has decided to ignore the advice, not only a very good general advice from the Chief Science Advisor, but also to ignore the advice of the Chief Family Court Judge, to ignore the advice of all of the researchers that spoke at that meeting that day. Richie Poulton from Otago University, we had David Ferguson from the longitudinal study in Canterbury. We had everyone there with a long-term interest in evidence-based policy and intervention who've been working on these issues for many, many years, working with central government to bring about some change within our education system, within social development, across the range of policies where those policies need to be changed. And what have we got? We've had no explanation other than, anecdotally, it felt really good to be at the graduation ceremony. Well, I've been to lots of graduation ceremonies where I have felt really good about the change that has occurred. But I want to know that when change occurs, it's going to be long-term, it's going to be sustainable, and it's going to make a difference in the lives of these young people. That's what I want from the policy in this country. I think this bill is an insult to the appointment of a Chief Science Advisor. There is no evidence to back military-style boot camps as a method of achieving that long-term sustainable change that is needed often to override, and this is where I think we are being honest on both sides of the House, to override an upbringing that no one in this House has experienced. Mr Speaker, the Minister talked of the people who gave evidence at the Select Committee. Those who are committed to making a real difference actually opposed the provisions in this bill. They were not evidence-based. Let me just refer briefly to the actual kinds of interventions that came up at the discussion we had on the ministerial drivers of crime meeting. First of all, provide parenting advice, support and intervention from pregnancy and through early childhood years, particularly in vulnerable families, those in poverty, young mothers and parental criminality. provide coordinated and effective early screening, diagnosis and intervention programs for at-risk families and individuals, encompassing and addressing a wide range of issues such as conduct disorder, mental health issues, family dysfunction. Address the alienation and disengagement of young people from education, giving teachers the skills and support to deal with difficult behaviour, improving alternative education provision and pathways back into education for those who are excluded or not enrolled. Well, this government's got rid of all of the adult and community education to speak of in my electorate, and which is just exactly the opposite of what was recommended from this meeting. Provide more accessible and timely mental health, drug and alcohol treatment services with greater use of tikanga Māori-based models. And I thought that was very interesting because the bill that we're going to be dealing with next actually is a carryover from legislation that our government introduced. And guess what? All of the provisions about access to addiction programs have been completely expunged from the bill. They've gone. So we can see that this government is not really interested in getting to the root of the problem. They're actually more interested in the headline news. Provide positive leisure, sports and cultural activities and role models for young people to give them positive focus for their spare time and energy and build their confidence, identity and sense of belonging and worth within society. That's the sort of thing that does make a difference. I've heard Judge Beecroft use that expression, kids in sport stay out of court. You know, it's a pretty simple one, but they're busy, they're involved, they're engaged, they learn team activities. They're not individuals left to fight on their own. They learn those skills to work as a team player. Improve the quality and availability of therapeutic, rehabilitation and reintegration services for prisoners and offenders serving community-based sentences. Review the underpinning principles, structures and processes of the justice system to ensure that bias is addressed, the needs of victims are met and that justice system responses do not inadvertently increase crime. It's very interesting because, of course, we all know what the reality is about the effect on imprisoning people for longer does in terms of increased recidivism, but of course we don't want to talk publicly about facts. They might get in the way of a good headline. Reinvigorate a sense of caring and responsibility within communities by building community capacity, resources, leadership and social capital. And when the group was asked to actually say how this would happen in fact, the very first point that the group came up with was base interventions on evidence with a strong focus on what works and greater investment in research and evaluation. I actually thought this was a tremendous day. I felt very heartened by it. Support innovative, community-based and Māori design programs, but these need to be evaluated and they need to demonstrate effectiveness too. Develop an immediate long-term 10-year cross-party interagency approach to addressing the underlying drivers of crime in partnership with iwi and communities, and adopt a strengths-based approach that builds resilience and strengthens families and communities by building their capacity and capability. Adopt a resourcing model that provides sustained funding for effective programs, flexible funding to enable local responsiveness and build provider capacity and capability, and then build relationships between iwi to share ideas and models and initiatives. That's too hard for the government. It just seems that they've given up on what really works. Mr. Speaker, I've got a question for members on the other side of the House. Who are Alexander Tokurua Paihopa and Whaturangi Rawiri? How about Philip Kokazi, Ricky Rapira and Joe Kokazi? And maybe this quote from the Sunday Star Times website will help. Michael was brutally murdered nearly 4 years ago by 6 thugs, including this country's youngest killer, Bailey Junior Kiriki. The first 2 names I mentioned were the 2 young people who murdered Michael Choi, and the other 3 were the others like Bailey Kiriki, who were convicted of manslaughter. It took me ages to track down the names of the people who murdered Michael Choi because story after story after story only ever referred to Bailey Junior Kiriki. He was the one who contacted the pizza firm, who enticed the pizza deliverer to the house and who opened the door when Michael Choi arrived. What Bailey Junior Kiruriki did was wrong, but he has been additionally punished with the notoriety his youthful age has earned him, and the real killers, the murderers, well, nobody